Welcome to FO Exclusive. This is a monthly event that analyzes the three most important issues of the month. I'm Atul Singh, the founder, CEO, and editor-in-chief of Fair Observer. With me is Glenn Carl, a retired CIA officer, the author of The Interrogator, and a fantastic geopolitical analyst. In the next hour, the two of us, the Rajput and the Wasp, will make sense of the world. And our three top choices for September are: 1, Russian setbacks and response; 2, interest rate hikes; and 3, crisis in Europe. Without further ado, who better than a retired CIA man to educate us about Russian setbacks and the Russian response? Over to you, Glenn.
Okay, good evening. It's evening this time for me, where I am. The Russian subject is the one the easiest for me to speak of. I've followed the most closely of the three we've done, but also I think it is certainly the most dramatic and perhaps the most consequential, I think. So all of you, or most of you at least, will know pretty much the same facts that I know, but it's worthwhile laying out briefly the main events and then talking about why they are significant. So the big event in the past month since we last met was the Ukrainian advance offensive in eastern Ukraine. On September 6th, I believe it was, they broke through the Russian lines and reoccupied or liberated 3,000 square miles, I think it was. I don't think it was kilometers. I think it was, which would be 5,000 square kilometers, thereabouts. In any event, yeah, it's an area of 50 kilometers by 50 kilometers, roughly speaking. So 3,000 square kilometers. They did that because of the cumulative effect of the beating the Ukrainians have been giving to the Russian logistics, supply, and transportation links in particular. And this has been made possible especially by the provision by the United States to Ukraine of these famous now HIMARS guided rocket launchers with a effective range of up to 80 kilometers. They can hit anything. They can hit something the size of a lawnmower, I think, accurately that far away. And Ukrainian intelligence is quite good. So through a program of attrition, the Ukrainians isolated the front lines in the east and deprived them of the ability to move very well and to have the munitions and provisions necessary to fight. Even more importantly or brilliantly, this was done through a program of misdirection and disinformation. For weeks, the Ukrainians very cleverly had been confirming, without explicitly stating, that the offensive in the south near the city of Kherson was underway, that it would be very slow given resource, in particular personnel limitations on the part of the Ukrainians. One shouldn't bank on quick advances, but that was what was happening. The Russians clearly bought that and redeployed thousands of soldiers from the east to the south, which was exactly the trap that the Ukrainians wished to set. The Russian soldiers remaining were thinned and not of the top quality, after having coming after having suffered 6 months of constant losses. The Russians started the war with about 180,000 soldiers engaged. Estimates are that was constituted 85% of the Russian effective combat-ready trained personnel. Even though the military itself is theoretically 1 million people, those actually trained, equipped, and the ones on whom Russia would rely to conduct actual warfare, about 85% of that was put into Russia. Of those 180,000, at least 100,000 have been killed, wounded, or captured. You will have heard that Russia has instituted a partial conscription, calling up 300,000 reservists and dragooning, frankly, dissenters, demonstrators, giving the opportunity to convicts to go fight in the front, so as to make up for the losses and plug the growing holes in the Russian lines. The thing is, however, that even if all went smoothly, and the conscription has not, it would take a minimum of several months for these men to become effectively combat deployable. They will be sent, however, to the front much more quickly. One of the former American commanding generals in Europe was in charge in one of his assignments for all US military training, combat training. And as part of that assignment years ago, when he had it, he attended numerous training programs of the Russian military. And the title, paraphrasing the title of his assessment, was "The Russians are marching to a massacre," that it is not possible to train or use effectively the men and the quality of the men in the time frame given with the methods used from induction to deployment that the Russians have. So the front stabilized after the 5,000 square kilometer liberation, but that was in the east. The front in the south is much more incremental. Progress by Ukraine has been slow, but one suspects that the Ukrainians are, well, we know that they've done similar things in the south, meaning sort of eating away at the structures of support logistically and so on that are necessary for an army to fight at the front. So the momentum has completely shifted. The Ukrainians are not on the back foot. The Ukrainians for the past month have been defining the nature and the location and the outcome of combat operations. And all indications are that this will continue. Now, what does that mean? The cold weather is coming, a good thing for the Russians, but it does look as though the Ukrainian advances will continue. Whether dramatic, as we saw early in September, or incremental, we don't know. The Russian response to this was to organize, as you know, also the phony referenda in the occupied territories. The thinking seems to be that by so doing, Vladimir Putin can claim that attacking those areas, and then he'll integrate them after the results of the referenda and make them constituent parts of Russia, theoretically or ostensibly, so that he can then justify an escalation or say he's defending Russian territory rather than invading. Maybe that's what he's up to. I think some of it is sleight of hand to divert attention from disaster. We now even start to see, to my surprise, really, growing instances of demonstrations in opposition to the war by politicians, which is a not only career-threatening, but life-threatening act of courage, to people in Siberia protesting against the war. So the bottom line of all of this is that the momentum of the war has shifted. Ukraine is really now certain to survive. The worst case appears, so long as the West, largely meaning the United States, continues to fund and equip the Ukrainian army, whose the morale of which is sky high, as well as the the caliber, apparently, of their combat capabilities based on the training they have received and the doctrines they have embraced from NATO.
Well,
And I'll just finish in 1 second. So it looks like the worst case would be, tragically and perversely, a return to the status quo ante of February 24. And there is a possibility that Russia could be pushed out of most occupied territories now, which in the even larger scheme does protect this normative order in Europe, and it makes Ukraine, if not quickly a member of the EU, it's achieved all of the things that Vladimir Putin, just about all of the things, sought to stop, meaning the westernization of Ukraine.
Two things, Glenn, that in my view are important. Number one is partial mobilization that Putin has ordered. It's a form of conscription, and we have seen how many have been fleeing to the border to escape it.
Thousands, that's right, yeah.
And the second thing that is extremely important is Nord Stream. News coming in as we speak seems to suggest that it was sabotaged. Now, of course, that pipeline had been shut for a while, but the sabotage indicates that this pipeline could be out of action for 6 to 9 months. The last time it had a leak, it was out for 9 months. This raises the specter of a very cold winter for Europe and bleak prospects for governance in the form of inflation.
Well, I don't think whatever happened, I don't think it will materially change the rate of inflation or the availability or lack thereof of gas for the winter, since there wasn't any gas flowing already. It does. It's a mysterious act, because there's certainly no incentive for Ukraine to do that, I don't think, or for NATO to do that. And I really don't see a particular benefit that the Russians would derive, other than some have surmised it's somehow an indirect escalation against NATO and warning to NATO, which I don't find very compelling as an explanation. But you know, all nations engage in irrational acts from time to time.
I think
it is a mystery to me a little.
Yeah, I think the pipeline was shut, but there are certain things such as animal spirits, and people in finance certainly didn't expect this. Many of them didn't actually, and they are rattled. So it will make, if not a material, some difference to movement in energy markets and gas prices. But that is not, as you said, particularly significant. What is significant is that Russia is responding through means at its disposal and seems to have dug in for a fight, which implies that trouble for Ukraine might not be over, because now Ukraine's supply lines are stretched. Ukraine now has to defend a larger front, and Russia can just throw more men in the fight than Ukraine. So even though Ukraine has help from the US, it has HIMARS or HIMARS as you call them. It has got anti-tank missiles. It has got trained troops, and there are a lot of at least British personnel on the ground training the Ukrainians, if not the Americans. I know the Americans claim to deny it, but despite all of that, the operative question is it 1917 or is it 1941 or is it something in between? Because if it is 1917 and the Russian army is so rotten and the Russian system is so corrupt and Russia itself is so demoralized, then we could be looking at a post-Putin future. He could end up like the czars he emulates. On the other hand, if Russia is capable of reinventing itself, as Russia under Stalin was. In the early days of World War II, Stalin bungled badly. And yet Russia had the likes of Marshal Zhukov to win the war. Eventually, Russia was able to grind it out. And could be that the big bear could grind it out. Of course, the counter argument is that Russian women no longer have the same number of children. And so the old tactics of losing men may not work. But it remains to be seen. So there is that possibility. It could be something in between. And this could end up as a frozen conflict for a while and a rather painful winter for everyone, for Europe, for Russia, for Ukraine, for emerging economies that are going through economic meltdown because of this war. So there are a range of scenarios ahead.
Yeah, I think that you're right that the front and the focus for Putin, by necessity, but also by design, has, in force of circumstance, has shifted from where the two armies are clashing to Europe and to the winter. If the winter is so difficult for the European countries because of inflation, energy shortages, and so on, that it starts to divide or undercut European support for Ukraine, then during the winter, Russia will have time to prepare and move to the front a huge number of troops. And as you touched upon, Russia retains, for all its losses, dramatically more potential resources and personnel and material to bring to bear than Ukraine does, or would is the proper tense, I guess. And that's probably the best approach Putin can take at this point, and it might work. It might work. However, the assessment, and this is, I'm not confident to make this. I rely on the general. I think his name is Hertel, I think, who's the expert on the training. He says even his assessment is that even if the numbers of men, if Russia succeeds in bringing huge numbers of men, that given their system and the terrible inefficiency doesn't convey, the incompetence and rigidities of their training system and doctrines, that the men would not be particularly effective as combat arms.
Right. If there are questions on this subject, please send them to us. Otherwise, we will move on swiftly onto interest rate hikes. Now, those who follow interest rates know that the Federal Reserve has raised interest rates for the third time. And Jerome Powell, the chair of the Federal Reserve, has said, we have to get inflation behind us. So we are looking at a period of rising interest rates after a period of quantitative easing. Inflation has moved from food, energy, and goods to services. Rent has gone up. It is not just the Federal Reserve that is fighting inflation. The Bank of England raised its rate to 2.25. Now, that isn't a lot, but it is the highest it has been since 2008. The Swiss National Bank raised its key interest rates. And although the interest rate is just 0.5%, it is important to remember that it ended 7 years of negative rates. The Swiss Central Bank had interest rates of minus 0.25%, which meant that, say, putting your money in the bank cost you something. So this is a major change. Frankly, one last point very quickly about rising interest rates. Sweden's Riksbank, which has been more shy of raising interest rates, has also increased its interest rates. And it has done so by 1 percentage point. So the interest rate is not much, it is 1.75%. But it is the biggest increase in 3 decades. It is very clear from seeing the same action by different banks that we are living in a different era. And banks that oppose the trend, such as the Bank of Japan, which has maintained its ultra low rate, has found the yen sliding further against the dollar, which then means that Japan has to intervene in foreign exchange markets to shore up its currency. This is the first time Japan has had to do so since 1998. Remember, the yen had fallen before the latest intervention by 20% against the dollar this year. And those of you who have been going through headlines today will note something very interesting, at least interesting for us, Glenn and me, perhaps interesting for you, which is why you're here. The Chinese currency hit record lows against the US dollar. So the yuan, the internationally traded yuan, has fallen to its lowest level since data first became available in 2011. So China is going through its own crisis, the same as all other countries. What does this mean? Well, as with anything, there'll be winners and there'll be losers. If you are savers of money and you don't like risk and you put all your money in bonds, then maybe you're smiling. The era of lose money is over, and those who are fiscally responsible, such as ants, they finally get rewarded in the bleak winter, whilst those who have been investing in stock markets, maybe not the Indian stock market, but any stock market, such as the Hong Kong or Japan or Korea, you might not be too happy. And those who have borrowed money, like businesses or governments, and are vulnerable to rising interest rates, they might be particularly under risk of, at risk of going under. Rising interest rates also cause a curious phenomenon. Getting mortgages becomes more expensive. Already property prices are high, which means that those not on the property ladder will find it more and more difficult to get on one. So it is a brave new world, or rather it is a reversion to the old world. Paul Volcker did this back in the 1980s. He killed inflation. And so maybe it's back to the future, Glenn.
I think that we're all in for a recession. I'm not able to go into the specific details, country by country, of each development in response to the Federal Reserve Board's raising of rates, but I don't need to. I don't think one needs to. As always, you will know, most of you, I think, President Johnson once said that he could sneeze and the stock market would get a cold. Similarly, the United States remains dramatically the most influential element in the global economy. And when there is dramatic injection of capital, fiscal stimulus, which has occurred for more than a decade, and added to, as you've heard me say in great praise, by 3 historically large bills passed by the US Congress for infrastructure and for global warming issues and social programs, there will be inflationary pressures. Add to that the Ukraine war, and with energy being so critical to all economies, you'll have inflationary pressures. So we know inflation has gone up. pretty substantially, which is painful. And the response is to raise interest rates. If it's not done, as Powell has made clear, if it's done without enough vigor or not strongly enough to convince the markets and other players that the Federal Reserve is determined to bring down inflation, then inflation will come down as quickly. So the Fed's being pretty aggressive, and that is deflationary. And since also, at least in the United States, unemployment has been at historic lows, there's only one direction for unemployment to go. So we will have most likely a recession in the United States and pretty much everywhere for I don't know how long, whether moderate or longer, I don't know, but I think that it is unavoidable.
All right. A recession may be around the corner, but very importantly, what interest rates mean is that we are definitely at the end of quantitative easing. For a long time, at the end of quantitative easing, for a long time after the 2007-2008 financial crisis or the Great Recession, central banks decided that printing money was a good step to avoid recession. Now, some people may argue that quantitative easing was not so bad because it did keep the economy ticking over. And it did decrease the cost of capital for business and for government. But, and here's the big but, it also fueled a massive asset price bubble. Stock markets kept going up and up, up and away. Property prices rose. There was a lot of money sloshing around, chasing assets. The central banks, at some point, both in Europe and in the US, were buying private debt in markets, creating all sorts of moral hazards, which is jargon in economics for this fact that once you have fire insurance, you don't have the same incentive to take care of your house. So this meant that finance professionals took one risk too many. And despite the laws and legislation, the incentives for a lot of people in finance to play footsie was a bit too high. And also, quantitative easing was excellent if you owned assets, you became richer. Those who didn't couldn't get on to this increase in prosperity. And so wealth inequality in particular, which in my view is even more dangerous than income inequality, was exacerbated. And this era is certainly ending. This era will certainly not go on. So there may be some silver linings to this period of inflation and interest rate rises.
I have a somewhat different take. The US was the most aggressive proportionally. I mean, in absolute terms, certainly the largest, but most aggressive in these quantitative easing, quite clearly to sustain the demand, and in the full knowledge that injecting unprecedented liquidity into the economy would should ultimately prove inflationary. But the clear decision was, well, we can have another 1929 and Great Depression, or we can try to maintain employment, really, while recognizing that there would be inefficiencies and costs also. And when you look at the relative growth rates of the United States and Europe, which didn't engage in quantitative easing nearly as aggressively proportional to the economy, the US made the right choice. We still had a great recession, but that's not 25% unemployment for a decade, which was the real possibility. We're now paying the piper for having avoided a complete catastrophe. And the silver lining might be that we have problems that rather than catastrophe. And at some point, the Fed has been trying to ease off of quantitative easing for, I don't know, 5 years, I think, at this point. But perhaps it's hard to calculate what the right rate of backing out of it is.
Yeah, I think this is one of those instances where we have a slight disagreement. And in my view, there needed to be some infusion of liquidity, but I think the Fed didn't take the punch bowl away from the party for far too long. I also think that what occurred was more expedient than efficient. Merging big banks to make them even bigger. Too big to fail is now, even bigger to fail. I don't think that was a wise idea. Please.
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned. I think one of the failings that wasn't intended. I'm not sure what could have been done about it, but it is a bad thing that happened. Right. Is that corporations used the injection of funds to buy back stock in a dramatic to a dramatic extent. And when I first heard this years ago, I wasn't particularly concerned because I thought, well, it shouldn't really matter. And I was wrong to react that way off the cuff, because what's happened is what you touch upon, which is concentration of wealth, astounding profits for major corporations, this dramatic rise in the stock market until just several months ago, unfortunately for me. And all of those, that capital not going to the people that it was intended to, which you can argue contributes to the electoral success of the populist MAGA movement in the United States and elsewhere.
That is precisely my point, that the policy failed to deliver, and there was a timidity on the part of policymakers not to upset the apple cart. And I have sneaking suspicion that the highly expensive nature of American political campaigns might have something to do about it, because you really can't take strong action against the Wall Street elite, the hedge fund gang, and even the Silicon Valley aristocracy or nouveau aristocracy, if you have to go cap in hand to fight elections every 2 years, which is what congressmen do.
Well, the really depressing perspective is the one we've learned from Thomas Piketty, who has shown by analyzing essentially every economy and every economy from the dawn of history. It's an astounding work. He has shown categorically that the only time any society, any government has succeeded in substantially redirecting wealth, redistributing wealth, is as the result of a near nation-destroying cataclysm, an existential war and the destruction that entails, physical, material, or an economic cataclysm like the Great Depression of the 1930s. Those are the only instances when a government has succeeded in redistributing wealth. Otherwise, the trend towards concentration of wealth can be mitigated by essentially social democratic policies, but not stopped, which means that other than when disaster occurs, long term, it has proven impossible to avoid regime-threatening social disruptions and stress from concentration of wealth to the point where the vast majority of the population is at subsistence level. That's a very sobering prospect.
Yeah, and its case in point is the carried interest scandal. If you are managing a hedge fund, then you pay interest, or any private equity fund or venture capital fund. If you're managing capital, you pay tax at 15%, or maybe it's higher now, but that's called carried interest. And if you work, you pay income tax at a much higher rate. And the fact that the pitch is tilted in favor of finance and against those in industry, or for that matter, any profession, is not a healthy trait. Finance is supremely important in any economy. We do need financiers to connect debtors to creditors. We do need creative ways to unlock value. For instance, the mortgage-backed bonds were very useful in some ways, even though they did cause a crisis back in the day. But having said that, finance also has to function in a competitive environment and a regulated environment, wherein you don't have a few big players dominating the industry, or for that matter, you don't have regulators who have been captured by the players. The SEC is a classic example wherein lawyers rotate in and out of industry, which means they have conflicts of interest, and they are plotting their move to a particular industry they have benefited during their time in the SEC. And all of this bodes ill for the future of the economy, for the economy and the future of democracy itself.
Many of you probably will have thought about the move by President Biden and other nations to implement a global 15% minimum corporate tax on income, which is a step. It's less than experts and most of the politicians in favor of some measure like this think is called for, but it is substantially better than the circumstances at present, which allow this competition to the race to the bottom, where the countries with the lowest tax rates will have highest investment, but allowing thus ever more concentration in fewer hands of the capital. So it is a significant step in the right direction, but one also has to have the regulatory regime that Atul touched upon, which has been in the United States partially dismantled prior to 2008, and is partially to blame, to the partial explanation for the crash in 2008. And then you also want progressive taxation, where those rates should fall. One can have Donnybrook debates about legitimately, but unless one takes those measures, then we will come to look like the end of the Roman Republic. And we need a Cicero to write about it.
And that brings us on to the final topic we'll cover, and that is crisis in Europe. And it seems there are crises everywhere. We could go on till tomorrow if we were to speak about this topic, but we'll touch upon just a few developments. In Germany, the government has nationalized Uniper, which is the biggest gas importer. And of course, they were afraid that it would collapse. They've also taken control of 3 refineries of Rosneft. So we are starting to see nationalization again. And this is always a sign of failure of markets. Further on, Italy, which has been in the news, and we will finally have a woman prime minister in Italy. It seems as if we'll have, barring a last minute surprise. And people should be happy. You know, she's broken through the glass barrier or the glass ceiling in the land of Benito Mussolini, in the land of bare-chested machismo. Except it turns out that she rather liked Benito Mussolini. Italy is the EU's third largest economy. Of course, she said that she will govern for everyone. But, and here's the but, she has in the past expressed admiration for Mussolini. She has been identified as a far-right leader. In 1919, she gave a speech that finds a mention everywhere, including Wikipedia. I'm Georgia, I'm a woman, I'm a mother, I'm Italian, I'm Christian. Very simple, very concise, very clear. One has to give remarks for that. And she has promised a whole set of goodies. She has promised pensioners better support. She has promised family support. She is in favor of more spending, even though Italy is already the second most indebted country in the Eurozone. She wants Italians to have more children and less immigrants. It is a fascinating time. And naturally, the bureaucrats in Brussels are quivering a wee bit because this is yet another far-right leader in power. Poland has already proved problematic for Brussels. Hungary, shall we say, is more than problematic. And now they have Italy to deal with.
Yeah, to me, the significance of the issue is really well beyond. Meloni is just the Italian manifestation of the larger phenomenon about which we have spoken many times, and that to me is the most fascinating and important development socially, politically in Western nations, developed nations of our era. And this is the rise, it's called different things, of the populist right, the traditionalist reaction to globalization and increasing social diversity and so on. Meloni she spoke at a conservative political action committee conference, which is sort of the holy grail for American arch conservatives here, in which she said things that her points are the classic, frankly, fascist tropes of family, Christianity, Ein Volk, I suppose you say that, una nazione in Italian. No cultural pollution, that is our destruction. She believes in what's called the Great Conspiracy, which refers to a supposed plot by non-whites to invade Christian and white societies by the millions, to change the majority of population of each country, so that in some instances they can then become Muslim instead of Christian, or no longer be white. This is the white nationalism, part of the white nationalism creed in the United States and in Europe. And it's her rise and the rise of, she's close to Steve Bannon, the pseudo philosopher for times for Donald Trump, who gave a patina of intellectual cohesion to Trump's bloviating, but all about preserving the white race, keeping the little brown people out, keeping our countries Christian, not allowing deviance to pollute everyone. And deviance means that one must be heterosexual and we have two-parent family structure, and religion is central, which means Christianity, to a healthy society. And one can believe these things, but they are totalitarian. And if one doesn't fit the mold, and most people do not, one way or another, then what you have is a society imposed the way, with unity imposed the way Benito Mussolini did it. And the appeal of Mussolini, fascism, and Maloney is, well, we'll all be together and unified, and the trains will run on time. And that is fascism, which in practice led to the suppression of and deaths of thousands of people who didn't fit the mold quite. And that phenomenon is what's happening quite explicitly. Viktor Orban in Hungary enunciates this clearly, sincerely, this doctrine, and the same in countries throughout Europe, all responding to the pressures of our modern world. But that's, to me, the significance of Maloney. I think our friend and colleague Peter Isaacson and I were chatting earlier, and he said, he sort of, not that he dismissed the significance of the election in Italy, but he dismissed her as, in at least this following sense, a typical Italian event, which is that the Italian governmental structures are so unstable that she will probably not be around in 18 months. And that could well be true, but the phenomenon that brought her here is, to me, the large part of the story.
Yeah. She gave a great speech earlier this year to a raucous audience, and she said yes to the national family, no to the LGBT lobby, yes to sexual identity, no to gender ideology, no to Islamist violence, yes to secure borders, no to mass migration, no to big international finance, no to the bureaucrats of Brussels. Now, to be fair, I could agree with a few things in her speech, and therein lies the power of the appeal, because whilst it is easy to say, well, she represents this desire for certainty, she represents this nostalgia for fascism when the trains ran on time. It is also true that Italy has struggled, and it has struggled for a variety of reasons. Migration has been problematic. Integration of immigrant communities is not easy, particularly if they come from extremely socially conservative backgrounds. Big international finance certainly has been a bit dodgy, has been more than a bit dodgy. And the bureaucrats in Brussels are, well, some of them may be hard-working people working to improve European solidarity and prosperity, but a lot of them are time servers who do little and have their snouts in the trough. And so the appeal comes because existing structures have also failed. They have failed to deliver jobs. They've failed to tackle debt. They've failed to tackle the concerns of the public. And I don't think we can run away from that. That is partly why Giorgia Meloni has come up. And to make matters a bit tricky, two of her allies are quite warm when it comes to Vladimir Putin. Now, Silvio Berlusconi.
He's a big fan of Putin, yeah.
Yeah, Silvio Berlusconi has long been a fan, and he thinks Putin was pushed into invading Ukraine. And then there's Matteo Salvini, uh, who thinks Western sanctions on Russia may not be such a good idea. So, in a way, uh, Italy is now going to be a lukewarm member of NATO when it comes to action against Russia. So it's an interesting time indeed. There is, of course, an economic appeal, a social appeal, and a political appeal of Georgia. But there's also a dimension that touches upon geopolitics and international relations and war.
I'm afraid that's true. It could contribute to the stresses that will make relative success, or at least escape from catastrophe, possible for Vladimir Putin in Ukraine. We don't know, but certainly is possible.
Yeah, and moving on from Italy to the UK. The UK is also in a crisis. Of course, the Queen died. That was a crisis. And if that wasn't enough, the man who would be king, a movie once in which Sean Connery acted, ended. This time the star was Boris Johnson. And this time the movie was the man who would be world king. He was defenestrated, and Liz Truss came to power, and Liz Truss came with the promise of showering Britain with milk and honey. And she announced a scheme, or she and her chancellor, Kwasi Kwarteng, announced a scheme that will cut energy bills for businesses by around half over the winter. They decided to cap the wholesale price of electricity and gas. This was an extension of the huge financial support they had promised households. Of course, many firms risked bankruptcy because of soaring energy costs. But this extraordinary pump priming, which Britain hasn't seen for a while, has rattled markets. Margaret Thatcher is definitely dead. It is back to the glorious 1950s when Butts-Kellism operated, and we have John Maynard Keynes firmly in the saddle now. Actually, maybe even John Maynard Keynes is not in the saddle. John Maynard Keynes on steroids is in saddle. I don't know if he would have agreed with this policy, but this policy has triggered a financial meltdown. And as I have followed the news today, the Bank of England has had to intervene. It has promised to spend £5 billion a day for 13 days as it warns of material risk to UK financial stability. This £65 billion buying program aims to stem a crisis in government debt markets. Now, if that crisis is stemmed, that's okay, but this action will lead to another crisis. The move will be inflationary at a time of already high inflation.
It's a return to the good old days of the mid-1970s when...
Yeah, so it's the 60s and 70s, and the IMF is talking about the UK again after a long hiatus.
To me, the significance of Truss's appearance and I'll grant some significance to the Queen's death, I guess, is that it's the continuing tale of England transforming itself into a largely progressively inconsequential rock somewhere off the coast of Europe. It's the tale of what does Brexit mean? And Brexit means we don't like foreigners, and it's the triumph of little England, and we don't like change, and we've been the losers. And I shouldn't be dismissive, because Northern England in particular, many people and elements of England have suffered from the dramatic transformations that the world has lived over the last 40 years in particular, and its reaction against them. So this is playing out. This is part of the piper being paid for Brexit, which is the consequence or a reaction to, like the Trump movement in America is, and Meloni is in Italy, to the stresses on what had been the way of society, and is totally gone now with the passing of the Queen. I've always viewed the Commonwealth as sort of the ghost of empire, and sort of pitiful, frankly, I'm sorry to say, because I'm an Anglophile, but all of this is just the further interment of what was, and the reactions are, I guarantee, will not address the problems because they're trying to run away from them. And I would include in that Truss's announcement of this huge spending plan, taking us back to 1977. They should just install heaters in apartments that you have to put coins into for 5 minutes of heat, as it was 45 years ago, given the policies made. I find it shocking, or very distressing that it's depressing that they've led themselves into this impasse.
Well, in some ways, Brexit was inevitable. England was certainly in Europe, but not of it. It had a common law system. It has had continuity in its democracy. The EU for the UK was an economic decision. It was not a political project, as it was for Jacques Delors. For a lot of Europeans, the EU is a bulwark against war. The EU offers continuity of democracy. The EU offers a check on domestic pressures against democracy. For Britain, they've had a long democracy. And for them, the EU is more of a free trade area. And that tension never went away from the earliest days. And in some ways, the perils of globalization, the left behinds, not being compensated by those who enjoyed the benefits of globalization, such as the city boys and some city girls, resulted in tensions in that society. But now, of course, that they've opted for Brexit, the question is, all right, you don't like the EU, but what next? And that is the question that no one can seem to agree upon.
England has, some of you, most of you, I don't think will know, I'm in India now. And so to prepare for my coming and during my time here, I do what I always do, which is to read a lot about the specific issue or place that I'm focused on at the given time. So I'm, of course, reading about the end of the Raj and British control of India. And that had only ended shortly before I was born, but the aura of the empire was still very powerful and formative as I was growing up. Now I'm in my mid-60s. And when one thinks of that, one reads about how life was, even in my lifetime, it is flabbergasting. It's not a criticism of England, but it's inconceivable in our world that a nation of 70 million should aspire or in any way could ever have the position that it did up until World War II. And England hasn't, even now after 75 years, fully come to terms with the fact that it's a middling-sized country and not controlling, bizarrely, 1/4 of the globe. And on top of that, all of these former subjects are now appearing on the shores with and making things more cheaply than the British do, and so they are hiding.
Well, as we grow,
to be fair to them, my last thing is America has the same phenomenon. You have the northeastern and west coastern cultural elites that are quite happy with what's happening, and beyond that, while it's north-south in England, it's coastal versus heartland in America, and the reactions of stress are similar.
right, as we come to the end of our 1-hour dog and pony show, or canine and equine extravaganza, we have 3 questions. Question 1, annexation provides Russia an excuse to use nuclear weapons. Defense of its new borders. Putin is upping the ante. Is there any path to de-escalation? Glenn, shoot.
De-escalation, was that the question?
De-escalation.
I don't think that Putin, somebody said, one of the, on a program I heard a few days ago, that whenever somebody says, I am not bluffing, of course, they have proven that they are. And I don't believe, I've always thought Putin is quite rational. I think he makes mistakes. I disagree with most everything he does, but he's not delusional. And I don't believe that nuclear weapons are likely. Now, what counters that is that view is the classic view of a professional in foreign affairs, as I am, of the past 60 years. However, the past is not the present, and technology has changed, as I guess is implied in your question, so that a tactical nuclear weapon can have 1/100th the yield of the Hiroshima bomb, which then for some strategists makes it quite imaginable to use one in conflict. I don't think that's the case. Putin realizes, were he to do that, I don't think he even needed President Biden's warnings to know that it would change the nature of the war, and that he's struggling against Ukraine, and there's no gain for him conceivable in bringing NATO into what would then be a global historic conflict. So I don't see it happening, but no policymaker can dismiss it.
Right. Question 2. And question 2 is regarding the Great Conspiracy, which is news to me. Could Russia's involvement in the Syrian civil war been partially motivated to extend the war and ensure refugees flooded into Europe? If so, there's an element of truth to the conspiracy, but it's being misattributed.
Yeah, I don't think that the Russians engaged in Syria with the objective of causing millions of Middle Eastern refugees to inundate NATO. I think they intervened to shore up their only ally, who is Bashar Assad in Syria, and their only naval base in the Mediterranean. And then they had the happy opportunity of directing several million refugees to Europe. So they opportunistically took advantage of that and fostered that, but I don't believe that was their initial policy. It was a narrower, but still, and very coherent one of shoring up an important ally, maintaining a base, and becoming not just a significant, but in some ways one of the most significant players now in the Middle East, a circumstance which is part of Putin's longstanding effort to become a global power once again. And it's the first time Russia has had any influence in the Middle East since Anwar Sadat kicked them out of Egypt in 1972. So 50 years, literally. So those are Putin's objectives, and he has exceeded in, I think, all of them.
All right, the final question, I'll take this regarding Liz Truss. Why did the promise of tax reduction backfire? Did it indicate that government spending would be backed by continued deficit spending and or Bank of England creating more pounds for the deficit? The answer is yes. Liz Truss is cutting taxes, is spending more than what her government earns. And you can do that, but you have to spend in productive, higher growth investments, so that, okay, today you spend more than you earn, but in the future, that spending leads to higher earning. What Liz Truss is doing is that she's obviously distributing money to avoid hardship to households, to businesses, but she's barely keeping them afloat. And the markets have lost confidence in the ability of the UK government to pay its debts, at least temporarily, or they've lost confidence in the future of the UK as a dynamic economy. Already, the UK post-Brexit is struggling. Already, the UK, given its political instability and having changed 3 prime ministers, or 2, this is the 3rd one, since Brexit, is a country without direction. It is quite polarized. And so this whole pump priming, goodies giving, new budget triggered a crisis of confidence. And when the herd moves, it moves, as Boris Johnson once said. And when markets move, the pound can crash out of the exchange rate mechanism, as happened on Black Wednesday in 1992. So yes, markets have lost confidence. There is no way Liz Truss can pay for her spending, and it's clear, and was clear, that this would lead to a crisis. Living in Britain today, as a very dear friend of mine said, is like watching the Romans turn into Italians. And on that happy note, we have come to the end of our 1 hour and a bit for September. We'll see you next month. All the best with everything. And from Glenn and me, it's bye for now from India.
Bye.